Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Irish Studies seminar. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our visiting speaker today, Professor Patrick Joyce, Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Manchester, and as I'm sure, as most of you know, one of the leading social historians of his generation. Has written very widely on British industrial history and various aspects of social and cultural history of the United Kingdom. Has held visiting positions at Trinity College Dublin, Berkeley, LSE, and elsewhere. Quite recently published a memoir of growing up as the child of Irish parents in London, Going to My Father's House in 2021. And then earlier this year published this extremely important book, I think, Remembering Peasants, A Personal History of a Vanished World, which is an attempt to understand the culture of peasant life in Europe, using case studies drawn from the west of Ireland, the south of Italy, and Galicia in Poland in particular, and to explain why the European peasantry has almost completely disappeared as a social phenomenon which goes back thousands of years to the Neolithic, and which within several generations has virtually collapsed. What the implications of that are for our understanding of the world today and for our historical understanding of European history. So that's what Patrick's going to talk to us about today, about the book Remembering Peasants and some of the principal themes involved in it. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, well, thanks for the introduction, and thank you for all coming. What I thought I'd do today is mostly go through the book in terms of some of the photographs that are in it. Peter's told me that a number of you probably haven't read the book. I don't know how many have read it, how many haven't. So what I'm going to do is just talk around some photographs, because photographs are a pretty important part of the book. There's a kind of dialogue between the text and the photographs throughout the book, and a kind of certain thoughts about photographs as well, and what they do, and what they do in relation to time. So I thought I'd start by just reading from the beginning, from the prologue, two little sections really, which give some sense of what that world was and of its going. And the first one's from Poland, second one's from Donegal. Now I start with this because, well, amongst other reasons, other things, Annie Proulx says that she's been waiting much of her life to read this extraordinary book. So I thought, why miss out on that? I've got no reason to disagree with her, so I thought I'd put that there. But there is another reason, and that's, like, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but the British publishers, it was published by Scribner in America, and also Annie's publishers. And I think on the British side, they're not quite sure what a peasant was. So a peasant was kind of, it's a fine thing, a fine piece of work by Millet, and Millet's work on peasantry is really significant, I think, because he came from that kind of he came from a normally peasant background himself. Here, they were much more kind of open. So I don't know if Americans know what a peasant is better than the British. But perhaps they have some ideas. So they came across this lovely picture of two people in a village in central Italy. I think they're actually kind of village dwellers rather than actual land workers. So, that kind of situates the question, what are people, what does the word peasant mean to people? I mean, for the most part, most people, it means next to nothing. If you Google peasant, you'll get Peasants' War for about 10 pages, you know, of readouts. Or you'll get, you know, usual kind of jokes about peasants. So it's a general question about what a book about peasants is doing at the moment, which Peter kind of mentioned at the start. And I'll come back to that. What it was doing for me, I guess. No, I won't come back to it. I'll stay with it now for a bit. But what came to me about it was that, well, I'd seen that world disappear, and I wanted to do something myself, and it was a very personal kind of project as well. But I was very interested in seeing how that would kind of impact in a world where people are concerned about the ecological destruction of the world or threatened destruction of the world. It seemed to me that people had many ideas about nature, but not about the people who are in many ways the center of nature, people themselves. They were kind of abstracted out of it, really. And I wanted to put them back in, I guess, and make, well, in a way, it's a book kind of addressed to younger people in the sense that, you know, this is the world that's going, and the world that's coming is threatened in all sorts of ways. And it would be valuable to sort of dwell for a time on peasants. So I wanted to put them back into nature, and I wanted to say that their version of nature is very unlike ours. You know, something you venerate, wildness which you cultivate, and so on. And for peasants, nature is something different, something that's a kind of dualistic conflict of order and chaos a lot of the time, you know, and the making of order out of chaos and making the land work. I mean, I have a little story about a Polish peasant who goes to America and sees a mountain and hates it because, you know, you can't do anything with a mountain. You have to have, you know, what paradise is the flat land of Poland, of the great central plain of Europe. So I'll do it through photographs, and I'll be led astray because I'm doing that from a lot of the material in the book, particularly the attempts to kind of define a peasant, which in the end I'm not too worried about, to the question of the variety of the European peasantry and the difficult job of trying to say something general about the whole thing, trying to talk about a European peasantry, although I don't very often do that. And to find the unities and recognizing the constant differences between peasantries and drawing big distinctions between North-South Europe and East-West, you know, to do with serfdom, to do with the latifundia system and the feudal system in the north of the Alps and so on. So I'm going to kind of leave those larger questions out. I want to write a history then, which had a kind of personal element to it, and grounded that personal in some sense of what it really was in a larger sense I was talking about. And just talking to Peter now as well, I've always been conscious of the sort of, I mean, each country is insular in its own way, and Ireland is no less or no more insular than anywhere else, and which is pretty insular, I think. And I wanted to sort of talk about the experience that I knew constantly visiting Ireland from the 1950s. I wanted to put that in some kind of context, and it was Poland and Italy, really. So let me just start by reading, and you may have read these words already, but they're rather fine words. They come from an extraordinary work published around about 1918 by two scholars, one Polish, one American, the Polish peasant in Europe and America. And it's about their kind of way of seeing the world that was apparent among the peasants that one of the authors knew it very much firsthand in Poland. Every field knows its owner. The earth is indignant at every crime committed on its face. The moon watches and prayers are still said to it. The stars answer a woman or man who knows the right way to ask them. Nothing bad should be said near water. The wind listens and talks. While animals do not know as much as man, they know things he does not. The properties of plants and substances, for instance, which are shown to men by animals. Some animals understand and condemn the immoral acts of man. The bee will never stay with the thief. The stork and the swallow leave the farm when an evil deed has been committed there. The lark, which soars so high, is the favorite bird of the angels. During a storm, they hold it in their hands. And when, with every lightning flash, the heavens open, it is allowed to look in. And the second reading is from I can't remember the author now, it's about the account, Burnham's account of the Blue Stack Mountains in Donegal in the mid-70s. There's a misprint in the first page. It's the mid-70s. And he walks at night with a man called Jimmy. Not a light, Jimmy said. Not a light. I was puzzled by the remark and didn't answer. We walked on. They're all asleep, he went on. Not a man up. And you see the way we haven't met a man on the road, not a one. I wondered who Jimmy expected to meet on the road at 3 a.m., but I grunted a soft assent. We walked on along the ascending road once more in silence. Not a one, Jimmy repeated after a while. And then, as though he sensed my perplexity, he added, I remember the time there'd be ones up and down this road all night, until dawn, until morning they'd be coming and going, you see, rambling to the cards and music and dancing and all, piles of them always, all night, all night. So I kind of modulated the book by talking about the night and kind of the metaphor of the night of the European peasantry, if you like. And I'll go to the first image, which I've used more than once in writing that I've done. It's taken from, the images by Joseph Kudelka, who was a Czech photographer who photographed Prague 1968 famously. He came to Ireland as a kind of exile. He published a book of a photograph called Exiles, which you might know, which were about kind of margins of Europe. And one of his chosen margins was the gypsies in various parts of Europe, but west of Ireland. And the picture is a kind of, the motif of the crucifixion is there clearly, the three figures. The three figures are on top of Croagh Patrick, and it's 1972. And the person on the right is my first cousin, Joyce of Sean Shoya. And the person on the left is Paddy Kenny, who was married to Sean's sister. So these are my immediate family in the west of Ireland. And when I saw the film first, when I saw the photograph first, which I did many decades ago now, in the early 80s, purely by chance, I was very, very taken, very struck, as it were, because my kid had been somehow monumentalized. And in the book, well, I'm using it now as a way, I suppose, of simply talking about the way in which my own life has been interspersed with the content of this book. And these are some of the people that have been involved in it, particularly Sean Joyce on the right, who my father died when I was 17. I wrote the book previously, Go to My Father's House, in which I describe sort of something of that Irish growing up in London. And it's called Going to My Father's House, partly because, in many ways, my father died when I was 17. So when your father dies at that age, I know, it's kind of particularly hard because you're in the middle of a sort of post-teenage rebellion, and you don't really, you're full of nonsense, and you don't really know reality terribly well, and you regret not having known so much. So I went back. I was taken back, was nothing sort of monumental. It wasn't a pilgrimage or anything to the west of Ireland, particularly after his death. But before then, it was Wexford, my mother's place, in near where the Barrow and the shore connect, not far from Waterford. And that was a different world, but basically similar. So I suppose I use the photograph as well to kind of just think about time, think about the way in which the photo is extraordinarily kind of poignant. People are caught in all their vulnerability, and they're caught in the moment. And the moment is sort of purely transient, but at the same time it's timeless. Because here we are, you know, like over half a century later, looking at these people. And it's kind of timeless in a sense, but also timeful. There's a woman at the back who's wearing a short skirt, which were, you know, it signifies that we're talking about the 60s or the 70s. And here they are, three men in suits at a pilgrimage, which is very significant. I see the same thing across Europe, really, in many sites of pilgrimage. A kind of a retention of dignity, a paying of respect. Now, I don't know whether that year they would have walked, but they often did walk over the hills from Joyce country. Joyce country is between Loch Mask and Loch Corrib and goes out into Connemara to the west. They would have walked 20, 25 miles or so over the hills. And of course, you know, people, as you no doubt know, people would have gone up to these Kirkpatrick on their knees. So it's an image which kind of introduces a world that's very different from ours, gives that world a date, still going in the 1970s. And in a way, sort of, it's an art object. It's kind of appealing to a wide audience who are interested in that sort of thing. But it's a document as well, and a very personal document. So I wanted then to, let me go on to the next one. There's a lot to be said. I mean, in the book, I jumped several places. I jumped to a later chapter really here. I've got a chapter called The House, and I used the house as a kind of symbolical center of thinking about peasant culture, about the relationships between men and women and between parents and children. The actual shape of the house. Sorry, I'm a bit tired. I've been wandering in Belfast trying to think about how to talk about time in relation to what's going on in Belfast as well. I'll talk about, there's a new book I have in mind, but whether Belfast will feature in it, I don't know. But anyway, I digress. This is a picture of a woman called Ulla Brown in Marm Cross. Marm Cross is really part of Joyce country out to the west. And I want to talk about the interiors of houses. You'd be familiar. I saw houses like this in 1935. I saw houses like this in the 1960s in the west of Ireland, but in Wexford as well earlier on. Wexford more prosperous, more comfortable, the bigger hearth. The hearth here is very small. The kettle is kept warm, against the turf. You're smoking a pipe. What that is on the right, it's some kind of big divan bed or something. I don't know what it is. But anyway, a local folklorist who's from the area, our mother is from Joyce country, took me through a fair amount of material that she'd discovered herself, and the story of this woman and this woman's husband, and how he went to England, as so many did, like my father did. They came back. I think his son died in England, and he came back sort of a broken man. But they went to the shipyards in Hartlepool, I think it was. But my other folks around there, they usually went, my people went to the west of Ireland, to America. I had five uncles and aunts on that side, and three went to America. One, my father, to Britain, and one stayed. And on my mother's side, a very large family, 14, 11 or 10 who survived. And, the usual kind of cousinhood and the spread of connections across the British Isles and to Australia and so on. Really, I was wanting to kind of illustrate the outside, the inside of houses, what they actually look like in Poland and Italy, the various levels of comfort or discomfort. The house in Poland, often houses without chimneys, where the smoke, people lived bowed down, trying to avoid the smoke at the top layer of the room. In Poland, the black room and the white room, as they call it, the best room and the room they lived in, took their names from the kind of. I think there was a chimney tax, as far as I recollect, which, and then the kind of technology of building improved. But really, I was drawing. The book is really kind of anthropological, ethnographic in character, which is anything else. And I was trying to. I think about the symbolism, and of course, I drew on the many ethnographers, especially American ethnographers, anthropologists who flooded into Europe in the 60s and produced invaluable work. Of course, before them, people like the Irish Folklore Commission, from which this picture originates, they got to know some of the leading figures. They've almost got to know some of the leading figures in the Irish Folklore Commission and in the international world of folklore studies. I have various pictures of, I can't remember the actual character now, but her husband sitting, talking to, what is that? That collection of folk tales, that classification, famous one anyway, but one of the people, an American scholar, got to know the family, and the question then is taken up, on what evidence do we know about these people? So I was kind of introducing the question of the house, the symbology of the house, and I drew on Glassy, of course, Henry Glassy, who's done such remarkable, wonderful work. And on Polish context, that I don't speak Polish, but I managed to develop a lot of context. And was able to talk about the kind of symbolism, the entry into the house, the open door, the closed door, the construction of houses in relation to the points of the compass and so on. So that the house itself, inside and outside, is the kind of symbolic structure, as well as being a place that was lived in. And I wanted to get at the material side and the symbolic side, and at the same time kind of get into the question, look, how do we know about this? How do we know about these worlds? And it would be people like the Irish Folklore Commission. And, they come with their own ideas about how you classify culture, rural culture, a hierarchy of things they were interested in, things they weren't interested in. They don't usually ask about homosexuality or about sexual relations or about, levels of drunkenness or whatever. There's 100 things they don't ask about, but their kind of anthropological grasp is real and powerful, and I think does tell us an awful lot. And in the chapter on houses as well, I want to get into the kind of a ritual cycle of those who lived in these houses. So again, the house was for me a symbol, as well as me being interested in it as a symbolic structure. Right, now where am I going? The collectors and so on. Again, I touched upon those in different parts of the book about how we know about these people. Extraordinarily interesting people who are very little known, I think. Great Polish collector, a product of Polish Romantic revival in the early 19th century, a friend of Chopin, whose name escapes me. It'll come back to me later. One of the perils of being near 80, is the short-term memory goes a little bit. Anyway, never mind. Yeah, it was the ritual structure, the birth, marriage, and death, which I kind of was exploring there as well. And it's a wonderful picture. Anyway, she looks out at us, sort of looking into her eyes, smoking a pipe. I think it's a great close to her. And then in the book, I wanted to talk about belief systems, for want of a better word, whether they are systems or not. I came to the conclusion in the end they were pretty systematic, and there were quite a lot of similarities across Europe. This is a picture by one of the group that worked with Ernesto Di Martino. I don't know if people know Di Martino, but he was a wonderful Italian anthropologist of the post-war years, the interwar years, influenced by Gramsci and by Croce. A highly philosophical anthropologist in many ways. But anyway, he's the one who opened up the south of Italy, as it were. Well, no, he's not. And before him, of course, there's Christ Stopped at Eboli by Carlo Levi, which alerted Italian intellectuals and the Italian intellectual life, really, to this existence of what was going on in the south. As you know, in Italy, there's this tremendous north-south division. Out of Di Martino's work, which then owes this allegiance to Levi, who was exiled by the fascists to Basilicata, or Lucania, as it used to be known, impoverished district of the south. Levi's book, Christ Stopped at Eboli, influenced a whole range of people, Pasolini, Visconti, I think. They were involved with the Di Martino people. So much so that there's a kind of, in the Italian literature, there's a Di Martinian school of photography and film, which I make a little digression. I'm hoping to make a film. Well, I will be if we can get the funding together to make a film of the book with Pat Collins, who you may know his work, who recently had a wonderful feature film of McGann's, That They May Face the Rising Sun. So Pat and myself are going to sit down in Dublin in the next few days and see if we can work out a treatment or a screenplay or whatever you call it, and see if we can push on with the film. So, I mean, again, it's a question of how do we know these people? How do we know what went on? And Di Martino came with a whole kind of posse of psychologists and filmmakers and photographers who produced a wonderful, amazing body of work. But it means that the visual evidence is heavily Italian, which is wonderful but problematic. I don't think you get anything quite like the extraordinary kind of neo-realist explosion that you had in Italy after the Second World War. Anyway, Martino used photography to illustrate what's going on. And what's going on here is a particular ritual or rite in Basilicata, in a church where there's an annual gathering every year, and it's a kind of casting out of the spirit that's supposed to inhabit. It's the Taranta. I think I've got the right word. It's a few years since I wrote the book, so some of the details escape me. It's the kind of casting out of the supposed devil and evil that's within women. And Di Martino works out a very elaborate kind of socio-cultural, psychological explanation of what's going on. as a certain relief of a psychological crisis amongst women in that kind of society, highly stratified in terms of gender. Now, whether the explanation holds or not my immediate interest, but Di Martino is wonderful if you haven't read him. Now, what's happening is they're on an altar, a Christian altar. This is the woman who's, as it were, possessed. And a man is a kind of master of ceremonies. Their names are available, and I use them in the book. He's kind of conducting ceremonies. There are many photographs and some films freely available online of the casting out and of the impassioned movements of women's bodies on the floor as they are released. So the purpose of this was to kind of, okay, get into the question of belief systems, but trying to say, you know, that really, I want to say a lot about religion. I do say a lot about religion, and it's mostly Catholicism, peasant religion. The peasant religion is, as we know quite well, you know, syncretic. It's a mixture of many sorts of beliefs, which are not necessarily hundreds or thousands of years old, but are an expression of another system, belief system, which ran alongside and integrated with Christianity for a very long time. So the kind of religion I was interested in, well, I was deeply fascinated actually by the way in which, again, I go back to the source, the Polish peasant in Europe and America. It's got one of the most striking kind of descriptions of this, the more systemic character of Polish peasant beliefs round about the start of the 20th century. The way in which, you know, there's a kind of human, there's a kind of natural element to it, where one is talking about nature as a force, but not as a spirit. And that the first reading kind of draws on that. And then there's another level in which there's a kind of spirits, but it's the world of the spirits, basically. It might be a vampire, it might be the banshee equivalent, it might be a whole range of different things. In Poland, there was there were a whole range of different kinds of vampires. Never mind all the other kind of figures that to do with the clouds, to do with the earth. The world of the spirits. Well, what was interesting was these gradations from the natural to the spiritual, and then from the world of spirits to the divine. There were some hard distinctions made, but there were continuities as well. And it opened my eyes to this other world in many ways. And for me, perhaps that was the most striking material I came across. I don't know, perhaps because I'm just ignorant about it beforehand. But yeah, that opened the door to thinking about beliefs and what we regard as beliefs. And of course, again, I return to Glassy in many respects, who Pat Collins has made a film of Glassy's work, you may know. So we have something in common, and maybe we'll get Henry Glassy to appear in our film if it comes off. Anyway, to get to religion as such, this is a picture by Markéta Lysakova, who was a wonderful Czech photographer. She accompanied, by chance, she accompanied Kudelka on the same day as he took the first photograph, 1972. She stayed in Westport and he went out to Kilpatrick. But I'll come to her in a minute, more of her photographs in a minute. But she's a wonderful photographer, and there's a book of it's a catalogue of Victoria and Albert exhibition in, I'm not sure when it was now, 73 or 74, maybe a bit later, and it's called Pilgrims. It's expensive to get a copy now. It's one of these art objects, you know, But there are plenty of images online from Mustafa. And I went to talk to her, and I went to in London, and she lived in the neighbourhood where I grew up, perchance, you know, so these strange crossings of lives and events, which I are conscious of. It's a pilgrimage at the Church of Levoce in northern Slovakia, and the people have walked maybe 30, 40 kilometers. And you can see for yourself in prostration as they arrive before the image of the Virgin Mary. It gives you some idea of the level of devotion. Now, this was during communist times, and these people had taken a chance. They're taken to the public places. How to read the photograph clearly is a devotion. But what's happening beside younger people there, I don't know. There's many things going on in it, but clearly it is about another world, a world that's very different from ours. We haven't completely lost it, but we nearly have. You'll still see that, of course. There's a fantastic film I come across by. I'll come back to it. Don't worry. Lustakova took very many images of this village in northern Slovakia. This is based in Levoce, which is a town, a famous pilgrimage site in northern Slovakia, not very far from the village. The village was an upland village. She talked to me about the situation of peasants under communism. So in the book, I wanted to kind of have a little narrative going through as well, you know, and it comes out in the photographs from time to time. Belief systems of the early 19th century, and then the persistence into the 1960s. And the context here, Luskova came from Prague. She was Prague intellectual. In the situation of a very severe communist suppression after '68. Beforehand, it was relatively lax and they had a chance to move out. But she discovered this world that she just didn't know was there. And, you know, it was the world I knew already by the 60s. And she discovered something very analogous in Slovakia. And the collection is remarkable. And hopefully it will be published someday as a, you know, an accessible, affordable document. In the book, I address the question of how the photographs came about and how they interact with the world that she was taking photographs of. She told me a story about this priest, about, you know, the way in which he spoke, the authority he had as a man's man, how he stood out against communists. There are various pictures in Pilgrims itself. I didn't include one of them here. But the story is, of course, of the kind of attempted collectivization of agriculture, which was pretty successful in Czechoslovakia, very different in Poland, where they didn't really, they couldn't afford to push too hard against the peasants. Communists were quite, again, contemptuous of peasants, but at the same time, quite scared of them. And they didn't want to push them too hard. So collectivization never really took off in Poland, but it did elsewhere. And again, in the book, I described the situation as people found themselves in their religion embedded in the fact that they often had to take to the hills in secret to particular shrines that they would have. But then, you know, there were spaces at times for public display. This is another Lyskova one, which she took, I think, a few days after Kudelka took the other one. It's, you know, the chapel on the top of Quote Patrick's, by the side of that, and people in their bare feet. These will be familiar to an Irish audience, but not to one outside Ireland. Maybe they're not so familiar these days to people in Ireland either. But anyway, that's not part of the Pilgrim's book, but it shows the kind of similarities, I think, before the two photographs. The nature of belief, the depth of the seeming depth of human emotion that's involved in religious observance in both photographs. Pat Collins has done a fine film actually on Pope Patrick himself. So I spent a lot of time really talking about a quite long chapter on religion, which was about cults. I kind of divided it up into cults. What did I do? Cults, images, Virgin Mary in Poland, of course, and the importance of the Virgin Mary in Polish history, the declining importance of religion in Poland, but still its considerable significance compared to the doleful influence of anti-Semitism in Polish Catholicism, amongst many other problems. But then again, I wanted to push this idea that we're talking about a kind of a peasant religion, and it's not the same as the established religion. There are all sorts of complex relationships between the two. So yeah, in the book, I have two chapters. One called The World, and that's about belief systems, the lark that sees into heaven, which is an expression that's kind of embedded into the discussion around this gradation from the natural to the spiritual to the divine. And the role of the lark across different cultures is clearly evident, you know, including Native American cultures, which I cite very briefly. So then the chapter on God is called I Have Created the Vermin and the Birds for People to Prosper. And that title was taken from accounts of what Polish and Belarusian, amongst other scholars, Hungarian scholars, talk about as the folk Bible. It's extraordinary kind of a series of beliefs about the cosmogony of the world, the origin of the world, things taken from the Apocrypha as well as from the accepted scripture. Again, work that's not very often translated, but again relied on connections, informal connections with people to fill out the story. Yeah, the particular God, the title reminds me, I've created the vermin and the birds for people to prosper. The peasant God is often, you know, it's what matters is not God, it's Christ or Mary, or it's the saints. And God in these particular texts, particular reads of the folk Bible, is forgetful, a bit stupid. He makes the world and then kind of goes away and forgets that he's made the world, and you know, comes back and finds it's all buggered up by the devil or something. And that kind of similar stories like that. So then I kind of wanted to talk about the more political side, the side of the side of oppression, of violence, of reactions to poverty, abnegation, humiliation. I didn't want to, above all, sorry, this is another one which I should have forgot. I didn't want to forget the degradation of peasant life in many respects and the achievement of order in the face of that degradation. There's a section I didn't talk about at all, which is about the curse of Adam, the curse of Ham, the curse that's upon peasants traditionally in lots of cultures, as those who are ejected from the Garden of Eden. A lot of it goes back again in the folk Bible to the idea of the origins of good and evil, and Adam as Adam and Eve are the excluded, but Adam is the cultivator of the soil and so on. So a kind of dignity is gained in the indignity of the original expulsion. This is another illustration of Polish folk. That's another word I wanted to get out of the vocabulary, folk, for various reasons, because well, obvious enough, the kind of connotations it carries: folk music, folk art, folk tradition, and so on. This is from the Silesian. There's a spelling mistake there, I see. There were 3 or 4 more photographs taken by I can't remember his name now. I use it in the book, but a very fine photographer. And this is in the strange area of Silesia, which is kind of like in between Poland on the one hand, which is a part, and then Germany on the other hand, and then the Czech, what's now the Czech Republic. Silesia, they feel themselves not quite Polish, but they're certainly not German. And a special kind of history, a special kind of current. I was very aware in the chapter on religion, I had some material not just on Catholicism, but on Protestantism, on the Word, on the Bible, and the importance of the Word to especially Lutheran peasants. Now these are Catholic peasants, and that's again a picture in Silesia. So let me go on to Millet's great picture, I think, of a man with a hoe. And this is from the chapter in which I want to talk about exploitation. And a lot of it is about Ireland, and is about the west of Ireland, and about the kind of explosion of violence that occurred in the 1880s in my own neck of the woods in the west of Ireland. The Malmtrasna murders, which you may know about, which murders, kind of mass murder in a way, of 5 members of the Joyce family from Malmtrasna. Malmtrasna is a townland just over the mountain from the mountain where my father's people come from. Kilbride is the name of my father's place. So yeah, I mean, that coincided in a kind of, at the time Mayo was that part of Joyce country, which was the bloodiest part of Ireland and so. And the Malmtrasna case, as you know, they've been filmed, it's been on RTE, and there's been Keller's book recently. But that kind of happened on my people's doorstep. But it was accompanied by the sort of land league agitation, and by the various organisations that may or may not have been active at the time, and the murders were tied up with the extreme poverty of the situation. They were probably to do with sheep stealing or a feud of some sort, So I mean, I was trying to get into the way in which a lot of violence that peasants experience is self-inflicted. The feud, especially in southern Europe, but again in this Irish context, there's a kind of feud-like aspect to these murders. But then, the whole thing was the Malmtrasna murders were part of the kind of the other stuff that was going on in exactly the same place, in my father's place, across the lake, a mile across the lake, the assassination of the agent of a local landowner and the agent's young son. Several other murders, the boycott, the emergence of Captain Boycott and all of that is very near to my father's place as well, the Neil, it's called. So again, I wanted to explore that, but I wanted also to consider the kind of day-to-day violence, humiliation inflicted on peasants. And that chapter is called Suffering and Its Redress, and he starts off with a famous, or maybe not so famous, poem by Seamus Heaney about when the balance is struck, and when the balance falls on one side, and you just had enough. There's nothing left but violence, or just simply self-abnegation, giving in, collapse of any kind of will to resist. The chapter's called subtitle "The Devil in Our Purses," and it's from some material I found for Brittany about. It's a book called The Horse of Pride, and it was published in the 1970s in France. It sold 1 million copies, which is extraordinary. At a time when France was aware that, yes, they were seeing the end of this peasant world. They were really aware of it in the 70s. And I think maybe that was much more important juncture in French history than is often thought. I think a lot of the historians, Nora, for instance, in thinking about the emergence of memory and your relationship with memory and history, I think that was in the end of peasant Europe was in his mind as well. And this was time, of course, when everybody, when the bourgeoisie of France or of England or of Ireland, whatever, were buying these second homes, and it was the fantasy of leading the peasant life in the south, in France. So this was the heyday of the fantasy of peasant life, the bourgeois fantasy of peasant life. But anyway, it's from Brittany. The title. The Devil in Our Purses, and it's about the absolute desperation. It's having nothing in your purse, basically, and when you have an empty purse, empty pocket, that's where the devil is. You've reached the bottom, you've got nothing, sort of. And my digression was to do with how the book came out, the source of the book, The Horse of Pride, written by an articulate peasant. There are very few peasant memoirs, as you may know. I lean very heavily on one particular Polish one, which I could talk about. Just check the time. Yeah, I'm taking too much time. I'll start pushing on to an end. I used this picture because in the book I described the actual labour that would have been involved in using this adze, this heavy instrument for breaking up very rough ground. We know Millet's, John Berger is a big influence in the book. The works, the writing he did on peasant life, the way in which he summarized in very, very concise detail sometimes, what was significant, he thought significant about the peasant life that he felt was going in the 1970s and before. And of course, he went to the south of France. He went to France, I can't remember the particular area now, and lived there for many decades. His son lives there still. And Berger was an influence on the book. I think Berger's wonderful writing, but Berger's art criticism has wonderful, sometimes very wonderful essays about which bear on understanding peasant life. His discussion of Millet, discussion of Van Gogh, and so on. Also, some essays that just spring out. Some of the essays are not connected to any particular work. There's a wonderful thing called The Eater and the Eaten, which is about how peasants eat, as compared to how bourgeois eats. Berger is a Marxist. He uses the language of the bourgeoisie, which is not totally inaccurate language. He uses that language, and he writes out of the conjuncture of the 1970s. So again, back to Millet. We know Millet's work mostly. It's very fine to me, very fine pictures, the gleaners and the reapers and so on, which, as I think Berger observes, were actually to be found in many French peasant houses. They took that as a representation of themselves. So, but then this is at the kind of another level of the experience of being a peasant. So I'll race on and to get to the question of, well, what did peasants do about it? I mean, in the 20th century, they organized, and they often organized very effectively. But before then, there were a whole series, as we know, of peasant revolts. And this is one that maybe is a little less known. The Galician slaughter of 1846, a complicated story. If you've read Chris Clark's book about 1848, he uses Celle. I gave a talk at his seminar, and we talked about Celle at some length. He is you've got 1848, and then you've got this other kind of world in which peasants are not attached to the nation state at all. You know, the peasants, if they'd followed the logic of those who wished to emancipate them, the liberal intelligentsia who were in the Polish risings of the time, they would have followed the liberal landowner element, often young men, idealistic young men, or the urban liberal elements. But no, they chose to support the emperor. Galicia was part of the Austro-Hungarian division of Poland at the time, the Prussians and the Austro-Hungarians. And it's a story, it's not lightly called a slaughter. Well, Polish historians of peasant life now will say that we don't want to use the Galician slaughter. We want to talk about Galician revolt. But slaughter is quite a good word because they managed to actually kill about 1,000 landowners, burning, looting their manors, for which they suffered pretty heavy price from the ironically from the Austro-Hungarian Empire army itself. And this man is particularly interesting. He was a leader of the revolt, and I go into some kind of detail about him. I also talk about the west of Ireland, the kind of in parallel with what was going on here, different kinds of response, and then, you know, the agitations over land in Ireland, the more violent aspects of that, which were apparent in Joyce's country. But then the really severe slaughter, which was by no means the last of these big peasant jacquerie. This was kind of jacquerie led by this man who was personally humiliated by the local landowner, ended up killing the local landowner. I think on one of his hands, his fingers are cut off because Polish peasants used to cut off their fingers to avoid conscription in the army. But it doesn't seem to have done much good because he ended up in the army for a while, fought in various wars of the time. He led very expertly, highly coordinated, symbolically rich, when you actually consider it, insurrection of the time. Of course, their fear was that far from emancipating themselves, the liberal intelligentsia or liberal landowners would bring back serfdom, and serfdom was and to this day across Poland there are kind of crosses outside villages celebrating the end of serfdom in what was 1848, 47, I can't remember yet. But yeah, anyway, I'll push on. Again, the kind of eruption of time into peasant life, and this kind of underlying narrative that's in the book. This is a picture of, it's a very straightforward picture of peasants working in a field, 1943. I mean, the date would give away in some respects. But then there's a figure in the side who I think is a Polish auxiliary of the Nazi, of the SS. I can't remember the actual name now of the police force they call themselves, but you could see you could see the jackboots and the uniform. And the book kind of modulates then into what happened to peasants in the 20th century. I said a moment ago that what happened in Galicia wasn't the last expression. The Romanian rising of, I think, 1910 was extraordinarily vicious. 10,000 peasants were killed. Well, 10,000 was a total casualty figure, most of whom were peasants. And then a book I've recently read, and I wasn't aware of this enormous kind of peasant interwar interaction across the Balkans, which is a kind of rising. I'll remember the name of the author later on. It's a new book. I'll find it for you if you like. But again, if you look at the Russian Revolution, I mean, the kind of peasant revolts was going on within these larger risings. So We come to the end, I think, and here I'm just going to read a little section from a chapter of the book. At the end, at the end of the book, the last part of the book is called Remembering. The middle part is called The Worlds That Have Gone, and the first part is called Endings. And I have chapters, they remember, we remember, and then time accumulates. So the last one is a kind of an account of a journey through southern Poland in 2022. I can go into that later. This is from a section called The Voice of Objects. And I became very interested I give an account of being in a museum and the objects that are in a museum and what happens to the past in terms of the objects that are put in museums, the objects that are chosen to be put in museums. I'm in the museum, and then suddenly in the museum I turn a corner and see an item that fixes my attention powerfully. This is because there is something about it that doesn't seem to fit in, and more particularly, fit into the story that gives it its prescribed meaning. This story is that of the display. This story is that of the display theme it is set within, which is the advance of rural medicine and health, one of the seemingly self-evident stories, progress, by means of which we tell ourselves who we are. The object is unexpected and seems to ask us questions. It is a simple, cheap mattress, catalogued as Museum of English Rural Life 61/242. This is the museum catalogue photo of it. The mattress, for so it is called in the description, is actually made of woven carex, sedge, rather than from wheat or barley straw. In the coils of the object, time is itself coiled, ready to spring. The object was found walled up in a house in Titchfield, Hampshire, and may date from the 17th century or earlier. Such mattresses were used either for laying out the dead before they were placed in the coffin, or for the use of a woman in childbirth, and after use would probably have been burned, so this mattress may not have ever been used for either purpose, or as it was so used and has survived. Of course, it fits into the museum story, that of progress from primitivism to the National Health Service. But it also does not fit in either. It has too many potential meanings to be contained. For the object concerns the nature of life and death, both linked together in a sort of circle. It is also a mystery because this sort of thing was not supposed to survive, but this one did. It was designed to be destroyed, yet exists. The past speaks directly only in things that have not been handed down, writes Walter Benjamin, not been handed down, so that the manifold silences of the past are opened up to our hearing by what is not bequeathed, by the chance object, the detritus of the past included, like this mattress of the born and the dying. The mattress eludes storying, eludes firm meaning, eludes our understanding, but suggests much, precisely because it seems to have meant so little in its time. It sits in its own glass case, and I am again struck by the marked oddness of objects in museums, which are places radically set aside from the everyday world. This oddness consists of their being taken out of everyday use, and this being so, they will and must never be used again. It is decidedly strange to think of a museum object being returned to circulation, a spade to dig a trench, say. The object is relocated somewhere else, and so taken out of real time into museum time, where it sits potentially to the end of days. It enters museum space too, alone in its purpose-built wooden glass case, so that it is chased where once it might have been smeared with the bodily fluids of the dying and the newly born. You, the visitor, may not touch it or smell it. It is precisely not what it was originally, but has been sacralized as a token of time. It is sacred and not mundane. You should not mess with it, for it has entered a collection. The collection is made up of items which are catalogued in long and elaborate forms, and these add to the otherness of the museum object and to its sacrality. Now, that is from the last section of the book, and I'll finish here, not having realised I've gone on so long. I meant to make it about 40 minutes. Once you get going, you know.
Thank you, Patrick, for that overview of remembering peasants. We've got time for some questions. Open up to people in the room. We also have an audience online, so if you want to ask a question, raise your hand. We'll start. Yes, Liam.
Thank you, Abby. It was fascinating. One of my first, I started off my life, believe it or not, as a priest.
So, and your name is Liam?
Liam Campbell.
Liam Campbell.
But I remember the first time I experienced racism was actually taking a group of traveller people to Croagh Patrick, and we came to the pub at the bottom, which were called Campbell's. We weren't let in. But anyway, this may seem a rather controversial question. I come from Donegal. Do you think is the light gone? Is peasant? I think I've been reading quite a bit about land agitation, and I think it's a very contested place at the moment, the countryside, particularly with regard to land that was regarded as poor is now very valuable, whether it's wind farming, gold mining, that.
Yeah.
And I suppose really what I wanted to just, it's a fascinating concept, the notion of the peasant, but I just don't know, is it gone? That's what I'm asking you. Is it vanished?
Well, it's a difficult question to answer, as is the question of, you know, what is a peasant in the first place? Kind of question of gradations. But the family economy is pretty central to the idea of a peasant. But anyway, that aside, how's it gone? Oh, for the most part, yeah, I think in two senses, really. The amount of people who live now who will give their time, total full time, to farming, people just don't do that. You know, they don't have the time. They don't think of time in those ways. I mean, I think I've seen this in evidence in Poland, Romania, and so on. You know, there are farmers that hold on, the sons, grandsons of people, and you know, you can make a better living than you used to, as you're indicating. But that becomes more and more difficult. I'm going to a conference in Poland next year, amongst people whose specialisms I know nothing about, but they're experts in biological diversity, and they're thinking about how can we regenerate the small farmer sector, and they're thinking about it seriously. But around them in southern Poland is the kind of disintegration of that peasant life. You know, I mean, if we talk about peasants, I mean, it's usually peasants as part of a society in which they are recognized as a group. These people who will go into new kinds of farming that will probably emerge are going to be a pretty small minority. They'll have to fight their way against the big agribusinesses, you know. And they may be successful, but there'll be small entrepreneurs, I think, who won't have the mentality of peasant life, you know, won't have the kind of integrity of the village, say, or of the townland, or of the sources of identity that brought them together, the mutuality of working together, the existence in a society where they are recognized and despised often as peasants. So in that kind of both senses, in the kind of social sense of the peasantry as a class, if you like. It's difficult to kind of think of them as a class, but yeah, let's think of them as a class. And they won't be in that kind of peasanthood. I've seen various, you know, documentaries about this attempt going on to repopulate the land by the small provider. Several people talking, women especially, talking about nobody wants to do this kind of thing anymore. They keep saying that nobody wants to do it. Nobody wants to do it. There are people out there who do, but you know, I was struck by her testimony as kind of, yeah, well, she's saying a lot there, really. You know, when pinch comes to shove, there are very few who want to do it. But yeah, I mean, well, are they left? Of course, peasants are left in the rest of the world, and the further east you go in Europe, I mean, if you go into the transformation of Turkey, for instance, from a peasant country has been phenomenal. But then again, if you go to Georgia, for instance, people who work on the land, the statistics are pretty crude and number employed in agriculture. The poorer the country, the more likely it is to have some kind of peasant identity. Moldova, the poorest country in Europe, is the most agricultural country in Europe. You know? There are still a lot of small farmers in Ukraine, but the Ukrainian farming has been taken over by the big boys, by the oligarchs. The money is in agriculture now. You know, they supply Africa. They supply large parts of the world. I don't know. I think with this film, with Pat Collins, if we do it, we want to try and explore a little bit the older generations of people in southern Poland, say. But in Italy, it's large. It's the children of peasants employ the cheap and often exploited labour of migrants from Libya or from Algeria. Yeah. So, and they're kind of business minded. They're much more entrepreneurial. The family economy. I mean, the classic definition of peasant is the reproduction of the family economy. You know, not oriented to profit, oriented to the sustainability of the family unit. These people are not in that frame. Well, to some extent they are. They're often family outfits, you know, but they think economically. They think in terms of profit. But, you know, there's shades and differences, but I think the world has gone. But of course, then if we talk about India, we talk about China, and then the transformation of China is amazing. You know, from a kind of a non-peasant country, but India and Pakistan are still at the centre in sub-Saharan Africa. Still, sorry.
Constantine.
Quite a good link to my question. Thank you for absolutely fascinating lecture. So there's link to what you said about the sustainability model of the family economy. There's this concept of the model economy, which is quite important and influential when we discuss about peasant societies or peasants as a class, as you said, or political consciousness, if you will, in that society.
Yeah.
So in your work, because this has been quite a controversial debate, would you say there is a degradation of this concept, or even a cutoff that you can see coming at some point in the 20th century, where it stops being a moral economy and it starts being what you describe, like this business-minded capitalist agriculture? And if so, where would you put that moment of transition or period of transition? When does that happen, and why and how?
I've been hard put to give, as I was saying to Peter before, I'm not an expert on peasants, so I just happened to write this book. So I kind of plead ignorance to some extent, but that's not good enough. I don't know, you see it in the west of Ireland, amongst my family there, you know. They've become what they call, well, when did it happen? I think probably, I don't know, sometime in the 70s and 80s, Burnham's book about Donegal and so on. I mean, clearly, these are the last of the last almost. I mean, emigration, you know, subsidies keeping things going, small scale farming. Yeah, okay, my folks in the west of Ireland do that. But they call themselves hobby farmers, and jokingly, self-deprecatingly kind of thing. But they are in a way, you know. I have the example of, you know, the sons and daughters of. You can see it happening, I think, in any part of Ireland, actually. You know. When does it become economically unviable for the old the old system to continue. And with that old system, you know, that kind of moral order that goes with it. The moral order is still there, I think, amongst the hobby farmers. You know, there's a sense of the land, and the region cuts deep still, and one is away, some distance away culturally from the Irish cities. Yeah. It's when American money comes in, I suppose. You think of, you think of the Botox factory in Westport, for instance, which employs almost, draws people in from miles around. People who would have worked, continued to work on the land. It didn't make sense economically anymore. I mean, the Americans pay a lot more money. When did it happen? I don't know. It happens in Germany in a similar kind of way, a little bit earlier, I think. I'm just trying to think of particular work that talks about the German example and the spread of kind of industrialization, post-Second World War, economic miracle and so on, way in which industry spreads out into the countryside. But then again, like traditionally through time, back into the 19th century, the kind of, with proto-industrialization, industry and rural work have been combined for a long time, sort of thing, without having an impact on that moral economy, I think. But it still continues. Sorry, I can't be more.
You talk about the phenomenon of the mountain bachelor in the book as well, and the collapse of the marriage market as well.
The collapse
very difficult
for
the family peasant farm.
Yes, indeed. Yes, thanks for the prompt. That's the key in many ways. It's when that family, when the family economy, which is at the centre of things, when that's no longer viable, with the figure of the bachelor who can't find a wife. My own cousin, Sean, who I loved deeply, and I dedicate the book to, he was in that category, He, his social life was taken up by the fellow bachelors on the hills around, kind of thing. People had gone to England. It's very similar to what Pierre Bourdieu describes in his wonderful book on peasant life. Bourdieu was the child of a postmaster in a peasant village in France, and he describes in a book called The Bachelor's Ball the to others seeming lumpen, clumsy peasant who really can't catch onto the ways of city folk or town folks, or even the town is a tiny town. The liberalized attitudes of the time, women don't want to marry her. The marriage market is much wider than it used to be. They can go off, they can emigrate, or they can work in different jobs. So the marriage market collapses, and the bachelor's ball in Bourdieu's work is a kind of symbol of the end of it all. If you can't get a wife, the family economy disintegrates, and with it, the moral economy you talk about. So I think it's then, the land is denuded. After the 1970s, I think in France, pretty rapidly everywhere.
I was quite struck by your last image of the museum, and how the museum kind of essentializes. And I'm wondering if there's an analogy there within the sense of the role of the historian, how the historian writes about the peasantry, in the sense that there's kind of is there a danger of idealizing or romanticizing kind of a way of life? I mean, you mentioned Pat Collins' work, which actually I was thinking of.
Mentioned?
Pat Collins' work, which I was thinking about even before you mentioned, actually thinking particularly his film that they made, Face to the Rising Sun, was tremendous. But one of the things I really liked about it was sort of the ambivalence with which it kind of portrayed rural life. It was really such a harsh life for the economic leaders and so on, the people who you might describe as peasants in that kind of film. And I kind of, so I suppose it's already it's a bit of a fuzzy question, but peasants engaging with modernity and ceasing to be peasants is a largely positive thing for many people who live in the countryside, so much so that the term peasant, comes to be the term used as connotations of shame and so on. So I guess I'm just wondering about your positionality in that, because in some ways you're portraying attractive aspects to life, and there's a nostalgic element of what's gone and what's lost and so on. But I'm kind of wondering, when do people in rural Ireland who make their living from the land stop being peasants, and to what extent is that maybe a positive thing for many of those people?
Yeah, well, throughout the book, I had this tension in my own mind, about not romanticizing the object I was talking about and trying to talk about the degradation and about the poverty, which I recognize and I try to bring out in the book, and which I remember well myself. Any idea that Connemara was some kind of idiot should have been there in the 70s and seen the sprouting of mobile homes about the place. It was a wreck. The economy. I think. Well, what do you say to that? In a sense, in the novel itself and in the film, I think a kind of balance is made in the end. And you have a sense that I wanted to convey a sense of loss, because there was real value in what was there, whether we call it pre-modern or not. Now, a lot of this book, my book, towards the end of it, I have a sections which I'm thinking about turning into another book, about how the past has changed in my own lifetime in relation to what has happened to our experience of time, the acceleration of time, the kind of the emergence of what's been called the omniscient present. I don't know if you know the work of Francois Hartog or the German sociologist Hartmut Rosa, Acceleration Society. I've become very interested in the relationship between changes in the nature of time, how we've moved, arguably, from we've moved from the modern to the postmodern, shorthand terms, and a postmodern seems to be associated with this kind of presentism. And my question then becomes, what happens to the past in this regime? Hartog wrote a book called Regimes of Historicity, which is really about regimes of temporality. And he's talking about what happens when time takes this form, this presentist time. When we lose the old forward sense of time that we had up until the 1970s, I would say, 80s. So what I'm trying to kind of locate this within is a broader picture of the sort of temporal come historical changes. How do we see the past? It was seen as a kind of narrative from which we emerged from modernity. The traditional and the modern, and then the late modern, postmodern. And there was a kind of movement, and peasants were located within that movement. But of course, in actual practice, these times were lived not consecutively, but concurrently, which is the interesting thing, which has hardly been explored. Historians, pay hardly any attention to time, which is their bread and butter. And it's very striking, I think. But there has been what they call inevitably a temporal turn recently in the literature. So people are more interested. But time is a historical construction. It's many things, but it's that amongst others. So, where do I, in a way, I could be accused of no, I don't think I'd be accused of glorifying peasants, but I do want to strike what I hope is a balance, and to say that the positive is vastly important, and we are vastly poorer if we forget it, and that we need we need knowledge of that world. We need to see what it was about as we negotiate these enormous shifts in how we experience time, as we move into a different experience of time, a different experience of the past, in which we no longer have, arguably up to about the 70s, after the, the 3 glorious decades at the end of the Second World War, when we seem to be moving forward, and then, things were stopped. And now we have the possibility of environmental collapse. We have Trump, we have post-truth society. We have a whole kind of different game in which the past figures in a very different way. That's not just related to regimes of temporality, but it is, that is an important thing. How people conceive of past, present, and future, how they configure them, is a major element in how they think about the possibilities of their lives. So the next book, I think, will be about, if I go around to finish it, would be about, well, what's happened to the past, the breakdown of that old, and then, in that kind of thinking comes this figure of the peasant again, which I want to emphasize that the positivity of it, the reality of it, as Pat Collins does as well, while recognizing the negative aspects. I suppose as a means of negotiating this kind of increasingly problematic present that we're moving into.
I step back. So.
This has to be a resource in which we can face the future with. Not just a kind of object lesson. I'm not thinking of peasants as ecologically virtuous or anything like that. But I'm thinking that this so-called pre-modern culture is something we need to bring with us into the we call it the postmodern.
I was just wondering, in your research for the book, if you found any difference in the histories of vanishing between the peasantry who lived off the land and those who lived off the sea?
Sorry, amongst those who...
Was there any difference in the sort of history of the vanishing between those who lived off the land and those who lived off the sea?
A good question. I wouldn't be able to answer, I think. The thing that comes first to mind, amongst... I'll speak of what first comes to mind, is a wonderful book by Voices of the Old Sea. Do you know it? By Norman Lewis, a wonderful writer. And it's about the end of the simultaneous end of the old peasant order in Spain, the Costa Brava, before the Costa Brava really got going. And it's about the tuna fishing industry. And in the films of Di Martino and people as well, they document the highly ritualized slaughter of the tuna by the fishermen. Yeah. And the short answer would be the Costa Brava, peasant culture, the tourist boom, the explosion of the tourist boom, just destroys simultaneously the fishing. And the people, they work on the land as well. They're farmers and fishermen. That is one, wonderful instance. If you haven't read the book, Voices of the Old Sea, it's a kind of dramatization of what is itself an amazing dramatization, which is the emergence of the Spanish costas, the whole tourist boom, which I was born before the time that really began to emerge, and now we take it for granted. But it kind of obliterated that whole world in Andalusia. But of course, before then, the Andalusian peasants, they were impoverished. They were moving to the cities, Barcelona, long before then. But this is one particular, and of course, the tourist industry is one of the things that destroys peasant culture, changes it. Doesn't always destroy it, but who wants to work on the land when they can keep their hands clean and work in a hotel and get regularly paid?
One more question.
That was fascinating, and I suppose my question comes about from a sort of John Berger perspective, because one of the points he would make about, say, images of peasants is, of course, they come from outside. From my own background, one of the things I was thinking about is actually representations of the Irish peasant, which you could say start with Swift's Yahoos and come up with McCahern and Donald Ryan. But in the middle of that, you have, say, William Carleton's Traits and Stories of the Irish Peasantry. And one of the keynotes of that, one of the anxieties of that, is he's constantly having to declare the authenticity of his representation because he's claiming to be doing it from inside.
Yeah.
But the very fact of doing it makes him an outsider to the peasantry.
Absolutely. I think the representations themselves, people say that they have a certain authenticity, but it eludes me, I have to say.
But it's almost about, as I said, sort of John Berger question, it's always about whether or not this is a group that is somehow or other ultimately unknown, because we only ever come from outside to them. They do not represent themselves, whether it's through photography or painting.
I think he refers to sometimes the sons and daughters of peasants as people who might represent. So that would be me.
Carlton, yeah.
And
I
Joyce would be one. You would be one. So in a sense, we saw and we represent. But there are peasant memoirs, you know, and they usually are written in strange circumstances. You know, there are several French ones. There's one by a man called Jan Slomka, or Schlomka, which I used in, it was just wonderful actually, it's online, for Poland. And it's kind of, you know, you take these guys with a grain of sand, he's a better off peasant, he doesn't like Jews, he doesn't like those who drink, he doesn't like, you know, but he wears all these prejudices on his shoulder. There's a vast amount of information, actually. It doesn't, you know, yeah, it's information from outside, but not all, you know, you have to kind of judge the sensitivity of the observer, don't you, you know?
So it's just the first image you started with. You said, you know, the image of the crucifixion is quite clear here. These monumental figures, and you know, this is Flag's Man of Iron.
Yeah,
50 years later. Yeah. And it's that sense that you're always producing an image of, rather than getting at the real thing. I suppose
to some extent, yeah. But when I was doing the book, I was in contact with Polish people younger than me, and a man called Michael Rauser, who I thank effusively in the introduction. He was the grandson of peasants, and a number of the people that I was working with, I deliberately kind of headed for people who were a bit like myself, only younger versions, whose parents had experienced this world and who had spent some of their, and Pat Collins himself grew up on a farm, and he still does a bit of farming down there. So you know, they're not totally unknown by any means, you know. I mean, you can go too far to the other extreme and say, you know, like they're unknowable, you know, if there's some kind of sacrosanct object. But in general, yeah, you're looking from the outside, and you're depending on the kind of sensitivities of some of these wonderful American anthropologists that I draw. I think they're terrific, you know.
So we have run over time a bit, so I think we'll have to draw things to a conclusion there. I hope Patrick's presentation has given you a sense of the complexity and the sophistication, the wide-ranging character of his investigation into remembering peasants, and the way in which it combines the personal, the deeply scholarly, the historical, the visual, the ethnographic. I think it is really an extraordinary piece of writing, and it's coming out in paperback in February.
In paperback, yeah.
with Penguin. So if you want to buy a copy, it will be available in the cheaper form at that point. Thank you very much, Patrick. Thank you. Thank you very much. And just a reminder before we wrap up, with another